I'm gonna bite my tongue a little bit for now, but what I will tell you is his contract is a disgrace. That is Eddie Hearn, one of the most powerful promoters in combat sports, reading the UFC heavyweight champion's contract out loud and calling it a disgrace. He is not the only one saying it. Tom Aspinall and Sean O'Malley have both criticized the UFC's pay gap on record. The $15 million match that lit the fuse. In late February 2026, Zuffa Boxing, the boxing division of TKO Group Holdings run by Dana White, signed British welterweight contender Conor Benn to a reported $15 million one-fight deal. The fight was set for April 11, 2026 against Regis Prograis, with no world title at stake. TKO president Mark Shapiro later confirmed that Saudi partners operating under the company Sila funded the payout in full. From Dana White's position, the deal was a business move. Zuffa Boxing needed star power. Ben had a following in the UK, a famous last name, and a style that moved tickets. The sell of money was there. The deal made sense. From inside the UFC locker room, none of that framing landed. Tom Aspinall was the first major name to say so directly. At a matchroom press conference, the interim UFC heavyweight champion did not hide where he stood. He said the Ben deal bothered everybody and followed it with, "If one guy is being paid $15 million and the other is getting $15,000, that's pretty different. Which is part of the reason I want to explore other options." The $15,000 figure was a rhetorical contrast, not a literal quote from his contract. Ranked UFC heavyweights earn well above that threshold in base pay. The point Aspinall was making had nothing to do with the exact number. It had everything to do with the ratio, what the sport generates at the top of the card versus what the people at the top of the card take home. Sean O'Malley arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. On the Ariel Helwani show, the former bantamweight champion said he had never heard of Conor Benn before the Zuffa Boxing announcement. Then he made his own situation explicit. "It's crazy how you put in so much work in the UFC. Build this name, create this character, be a star. I'm not making $15 million to fight." O'Malley was not speaking theoretically. He had headlined PPV events at the Sphere in Las Vegas, a venue that cost $2.3 billion to build. He had built a persona, Suga Show, that moved merchandise, drove pay-per-view purchases, and carried the kind of name recognition that takes years to manufacture. He was saying that none of it had added up to a single fight worth $15 million. Not once. Other fighters followed quickly. Michael Venom Page called the payout hurtful and disheartening, questioning publicly why outsiders received 8-figure guarantees while the fighters who built the UFC brand from the inside did not. Aljamain Sterling said, "There is no negotiating in UFC contract discussions," describing the structural absence of leverage that most fighters face when trying to push for better terms. Dana White gave his answer at a Zuffa Boxing post-fight presser. "Why is it a bad thing when guys make more money? It's always a good thing when there's more money in sport," he said. He pointed to doubled performance bonuses now reaching $100,000, the incoming $7.7 billion media rights deal with Paramount Global, and a track record of rising fighter salaries, he said, stretching back to 2001. He drew a clear line between Zuffa Boxing and the UFC, framing Benn's deal as a separate matter funded by separate partners. The UFC, valued at over $12 billion as part of TKO Group Holdings, was generating roughly $1.5 billion in annual UFC-specific revenue by 2025. The question being asked out loud in March 2026 was the same one that had circulated in locker rooms for decades. Where does that money actually go? And why, in an era of record revenues and landmark media deals, does the percentage reaching the fighters who generate it remain the same as it was when the UFC was a fraction of its current size? Aspinall makes his move. Tom Aspinall's response to the Ben signing was not another interview comment. It was a business decision, and one executed with the kind of deliberate precision that made it impossible for Dana White to dismiss as frustration in the moment. In early March 2026, Aspinall became the first major MMA client of Eddie Hearn's newly launched Matchroom talent agency. The timing was striking on its own. Hearn, the boxing promoter behind Matchroom Boxing and one of White's most publicly combative rivals, had just watched his star Conor Benn walk out the door and into Zuffa Boxing. Now, the man the UFC needed most for its highest-value heavyweight matchup was walking into Hearn's office. The structure of the arrangement was deliberately crafted to avoid a clean break. Aspinall would remain under his existing UFC contract for all fighting activity. Hearn's team would handle the commercial architecture around him: sponsorships, brand deals, appearance fees, and any external opportunities that his UFC contract either left untouched or claimed a cut of. It was a lever, not an exit. But to understand how significant that lever was, you had to see what happened when Hearn actually sat down and read the contract. The reaction came publicly without hesitation and in terms that left no room for interpretation. He began by signaling he was holding back. That phrasing, "bite my tongue," from a man who makes a professional living out of public confrontation, was itself a signal of how much worse the full version of his opinion was. But what I will tell you is his contract is a disgrace. A disgrace. That word landed in the middle of a sport-wide debate that had been simmering for years, dropped by a man who had spent 2 decades structuring some of the largest purses in professional boxing, who had just seen the terms under which the UFC heavyweight champion operates. Not anecdotally, not second-hand. He had read the document. A disgrace. And I cannot believe the money that he is on when you look at the commercial revenue that his fight would generate against a Pereira or against a Gain in a rematch. This was the precise axis of the argument. Not just the headline figure on Aspinall's contract, but the distance between that figure and what a fight against Alex Pereira or a rematch with Cyril Gain would realistically generate in gate receipts, international broadcast rights, pay-per-view revenue, and the kind of cultural attention that translates directly into the TV deals that make a company like TKO worth what it is worth. Aspinall had headlined sold-out events at the O2 Arena in London, one of the highest-grossing entertainment venues on the planet. And Hearn was telling the world that the number at the bottom of that contribution was, in his professional view, indefensible. And Hearn wasn't remotely finished. And honestly, if I'm Tom Aspinall, I'm looking at that contract and I go, I don't even think you should bother me. But he wants to come back. He wants to rematch Gain. The line that the UFC heavyweight champion should not even bother showing up is not the kind of thing a promoter says for shock value if he is trying to maintain a working relationship with the promotion that employs his new client. Hearn said it anyway because the financial conclusion he had reached after reading the contract was that the fight, against the physical cost, the team fees, the tax burden, and the time away from everything else, was a calculation that no longer made obvious economic sense from where he was sitting. Especially given what had happened to Aspinall's body to get here. There's no point in even fighting. Aspinall had gone through serious eye surgery following his bout with Cyril Gain in October 2025. The injury was not a minor setback. It required multiple operations and a recovery period that sidelined the champion through the beginning of 2026. The physical cost of competing at heavyweight in the UFC, torn ligaments, surgeries, broken orbital bones, does not appear in the line items of TKO's quarterly earnings report. It appears in the bodies of the fighters who generate those earnings. Especially when you had 4 operations after your eyes got gouged out. It is unbelievable. Hearn claimed that within 10 to 14 days of formalizing the partnership, Aspinall was already closing commercial deals worth more than what he had earned from one of his recent UFC appearances. He said more than a dozen other UFC fighters had reached out to his team after the announcement was made public. Aspinall's own framing of the move was measured and precise. In a YouTube reaction video, he said, "We've done most of my career with a really small team that I've got, so I wanted to add to my value. Eddie is someone I've known for a fair bit. I trust Eddie, and I want to make as much money and grow commercially as much as possible while I'm fighting. I just want to maximize the time I've got in the sport." He was not burning anything down. He was building a commercial structure that existed in the gaps of what his UFC contract could offer, and doing it in plain sight through a man who had every reason to make those gaps as visible as possible. Dana White's public response was dismissive. He said he did not understand why Aspinall would involve a boxing promoter in his affairs. He expressed skepticism about the arrangement and maintained that UFC pay continues to climb. What he did not do was address the specific financial argument Hearn had made: the revenue Aspinall generates, the percentage of it he sees, and whether those two numbers are proportionate. That gap between the argument and the response was its own kind of answer. Suga's calculated stand. Sean "Suga" O'Malley has never been a fighter who confuses noise with strategy. The flamboyant persona, the rainbow-tinted hair, the carefully manufactured Suga Show brand architecture, the podcast, the social media presence calibrated to drive engagement on every platform simultaneously. None of it happened by accident. So when O'Malley weighed into the fighter pay debate in March 2026, it was worth paying close attention not just to the words, but to the enormous distance between what he said and what he chose not to do. His reaction to the Ben deal was raw and immediate. He had never heard of the man. He said so without embarrassment because the lack of recognition was precisely the point, that an unrecognized British welterweight could receive $15 million for a single fight, while O'Malley, a former UFC champion who had headlined the Sphere in Las Vegas, one of the most technologically advanced entertainment venues ever constructed, had never approached that number in a single outing. That was a disparity that landed with specific personal force. O'Malley did not soften that on the Ariel Helwani show. He named it directly. He acknowledged the frustration, and then he drew a line that separated his response from everything Aspinall was doing. The line ran straight through Eddie Hearn's name. Speaking ahead of his bout against Iman Zahabi on the UFC's White House card, O'Malley said, "You don't want to make enemies with the UFC. I don't get what people are doing. I saw that Tom Aspinall signed with that Hearn dude. I don't really know if that's a great idea either. You're going to have someone manage you that Dana doesn't really like or something. That doesn't seem very smart." The word smart is doing a lot of work in that sentence. O'Malley was not disputing whether the contract was fair. He had already acknowledged it wasn't, even indirectly, but by name with a number attached. What he was disputing was whether the path Aspinall had chosen was the optimal way to address it. And that is where the Suga Show brand philosophy kicks in with full force. O'Malley's stated strategy has always been external accumulation. Perform at the highest level, cultivate the most recognizable persona in the sport, and build commercial value on the outside. Endorsements, content deals, brand partnerships, digital media ventures that generate income streams the UFC contract can't touch and can't restrict. Rather than try to renegotiate the terms of the machine from inside it, manufacture so much value outside it that the machine eventually has to acknowledge it. His participation in the White House card was a crystalline example of how the UFC uses cultural prestige as a retention mechanism in the absence of proportionally increased pay, to fight on the most photographed grounds in the United States, in front of a global media audience with political figures seated ringside. That is the kind of visibility that no pay packet can fully replace, and the UFC understands that with absolute clarity. O'Malley, being the commercial architect that he is, understood it too, and he took the appearance. He said he was honored. What he also said in the same breath was that he had a good relationship with the UFC and intended to keep it that way. Not because the system was fair. He had already told the world it wasn't, but because in his risk-reward calculation, the relationship was the asset, the foundation on which every external commercial deal was ultimately built. And burning it prematurely carried a cost that the short-term satisfaction of confrontation could not offset. There was even a moment during the lead-up to the White House card where a foot injury flagged during medical examinations introduced a new dimension to the conversation. Fighters absorb the risk of physical damage as a structural cost of their careers, with no insurance architecture or players association that reflects the scale of the revenue they generate. A foot problem in the week before a fight for a fighter at O'Malley's level is a week of anxiety that no one else in the revenue chain shares equally. Both positions carry their own logic. Both reflect what each fighter believes his specific leverage to be. And together, in the same media cycle, they created a two-sided conversation about fighter pay that was impossible for the UFC's standard press conference deflections to fully absorb. White strikes back, and the numbers. Dana White has occupied the executive director's seat of the UFC since 2001. In that time, he has heard a version of the fighter pay argument at approximately every stage of the company's growth, from the early Zuffa era when base purses were measured in thousands of dollars, through the ESPN deal that made the UFC part of the most powerful sports media machine in America, through the TKO merger, and now the Paramount Global Rights package. His response in March 2026 was familiar in structure and consistent in confidence. Why is it a bad thing when guys make more money? It's always a good thing when there's more money in sport, he said. He pointed to performance bonuses that had been doubled to $100,000. He pointed to the incoming Paramount deal as evidence that fighter pay would continue to rise. He described the Ben signing as a targeted investment funded by Saudi partnership money, structurally separate from how UFC fighters are compensated. He dismissed the idea that comparing a boxing superfight guarantee to a UFC contract was a meaningful comparison. Each of those points has a grain of defensible reality embedded in it. TKO Group Holdings announced a $150 million dividend to investors in the first quarter of 2026, a company healthy enough to hand that sum to shareholders. The Paramount deal, averaging approximately $1 billion per year across 7 years, represents a financial injection at a scale the UFC has never seen before. UFC-specific revenue was approaching $1.5 billion annually by 2025. These are not the numbers of a promotion struggling to make payroll. But the numbers that those figures exist alongside are the ones that make White's defense difficult to sustain past the first press conference. Court documents from the antitrust class action lawsuit filed by UFC fighters, which concluded in a $375 million settlement in 2024, revealed that in 2012, fighters received 18.6% of UFC event revenue. Independent analyses from Bloody Elbow, MMA Fighting, and financial outlets covering TKO Group place the current fighter revenue share at approximately 17 to 20%. In the NFL, NBA, and MLB, athletes receive 48 to 50% of league revenue. That 30 percentage point gap is the financial skeleton underneath every grievance you have heard from every fighter in this story. Justin Gaethje made this concrete with a specific claim in January 2026 at UFC 324 Media Day. One of the most decorated and bonus-laden fighters in lightweight history,